So thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation. And I must say, this is a problem when one invites a political scientist to an art history conference. I have 0 slides, not even a PowerPoint, nothing, just a bare text. So you'll have to bear with me, please. Given the Luciferian reputation of his political ideas, it was not long before readers of Machiavelli began to ask themselves what were his own religious beliefs. Was he a radical Epicurean, an atheist, or a libertine? Or was he a tormented Christian, all too aware, like Augustine, that the harsh realities of politics correspond to the fallen nature of human beings? Recently, the problem of God in Machiavelli has been brought back to the attention. Usually, the conjunction of God and politics in Machiavelli has been explained in terms of his belief in an idea of civil religion, that is, where religion is used only for political means. My question today is this all that Machiavelli has to say? Could it not also be that he is involved in something which we call nowadays political theology, that is, where theology is not just an instrument of politics, but its categories actually help to understand what politics is? And that's what I will try to argue. The relatively new claim that Machiavelli is not merely recovering an ancient conception of religion as an instrument of political rule, but is putting forth a political theology of his own, has been made by Maurizio Viroli in Machiavelli's God. According to Viroli, Machiavelli was neither an atheist nor a pagan. Quote, his God is the God of Florentine Republican Christianity. The first principle of this Republican Christianity is, quote, that a true Christian is a good citizen who serves the common good and liberty in order to implement the divine plan on earth. God participates in human history. He created men in his own image and wishes them to become like him with their virtue, working to make the earthly city comparable to the heavenly city, end quote. Now, and Viroli argues that all kinds of thinkers participate in this Republican idea of Christianity, from Thomas Aquinas to Leonardo Bruni, Savonarola to Matteo Palmieri, people who were usually very diverse. For that reason, I actually doubt that Machiavelli drew inspiration for his own experiments on political theology from this so-called tradition. However, Viroli does raise the crucial question of what conception of divine glory and divine nature Machiavelli could have held that would serve as a foundation for his new way to understand love of country and politics in general. I shall not engage the old question of Machiavelli's personal morality, nor the significance of his exhortation to penitence, a document in which he seems to act as if he were a Christian believer. For me, I think it is clear, and also I think for Machiavelli, that the real problem of the role of God in politics only emerges clearly once the belief in such a God is posed directly in relation to the most, what Machiavelli calls, ferocious and pitiless aspects of politics, as illustrated in Roman history and also by the Hebrew Bible. In other words, here we have two extremely religious people who are extremely ferocious, politically speaking. That's the God that interests Machiavelli. So in order to pose the question, who is Machiavelli's God, one would have to find a conception of God whose divine nature is such that by imitating this nature, it would motivate ferocious political actions, such that imitating this divine nature would make saintly someone who carries out what Machiavelli calls extraordinary commands, which are pretty brutal actions, as you know if you read Machiavelli. It's full of brutality. So I suggest that in order to see who is Machiavelli's God, we should then move not to this document, supposedly in which he makes a kind of Christian confession, but rather to the chapter 26, the exhortation to seize Italy, in which God all of a sudden appears at the end of The Prince, unexpectedly. In chapter 25, so the chapter before the last one, Machiavelli, I mean, the whole book is a series of shocking claims, but this is particularly shocking. He ends the chapter with a shocking claim that Fortuna, chance, the goddess Fortuna, is a woman and she likes to be beaten. Possibly, this is very important, by an audacious and young man. So if you're old and interesting, don't even try. But if you're a good-looking and audacious, then maybe Fortuna will like it. Fortuna grants her favors, we understand from the context, more easily to those leaders who arm and fight with their people. Chapter 26 asks the question, well, what about God, this other metaphysical player in Machiavelli's drama? So one is Fortuna, she likes audacity. What about God? The title of the last chapter, an exhortation to seize Italy and to set her free from the barbarians, actually lays at the feet of the Medici Dedicati, the two Medici Dedicatis. Machiavelli places at their feet the task that was the task of supposedly of Pope Julius II, known for his audacity, which he attempted half-heartedly and in any case failed to accomplish. Machiavelli's new prince, this was the task at the end of the book, must do or try to do what the Catholic Church never wanted to do, namely, unite Italy and make it impregnable to foreign conquests. Since the Church depended for its temporal power on keeping Italy divided and at the mercy of the barbarians, Machiavelli's proto-nationalist project also entailed bringing about the end or a serious limitation of the Church's temporal power. Additionally, in order to have any degree of success in this crazy enterprise that he was suggesting, the new prince would also have to grab absolute power. As you know very quickly, the new prince, Machiavelli says, should arrive to power as a civil prince, backed by some popular support or some democratic mechanism, but to achieve this crazy last enterprise, he will most probably need to take all power to himself and become absolute. So Machiavelli closes chapter 25 by praising audacity for good reason. He's preparing the reader for an extremely audacious proposition in chapter 26. Given this context, it makes sense for him at the end of the book to ask whether God would favor such audacity. In other words, what Machiavelli is asking is, would God be willing to see a new popular sovereign, a sovereign based on popular support, take the place of the Pope as his representative on earth? Now, once Machiavelli basically answers this question in the affirmative, terribly audacious proposal, which had actually never been asked or put this way before in such blunt terms, all the great modern political thinkers rushed through the breach he opened. Not one excluded. Hobbes, Spinoza, Rousseau, Kant, Hegel, Marx, all of them, in one form or another, had no qualms asserting that the march in history of popular sovereignty, the revolutionary conquest of monarchy and aristocracy by the power of the people, is the actual meaning of divine providence and the meaning of history. The question of God's role in politics crops up repeatedly in Machiavelli's discourse, but it reaches the climax in the last chapters. For many interpreters, chief among them Mario Martelli, who wrote, I think, the fundamental essay on chapter 26, this last chapter contains two basic riddles. Why does Machiavelli appeal to divine providence in order to support the ambitions of the new prince when he advances irreligious or frankly anti-religious theses throughout the book? Does he seriously mean what he says in the chapter, or is it merely a rhetorical flourish? The second riddle has to do with the monarchic airs taken on by the new prince at the end of the book, this prince who is to unify Italy. How does this stand together with his adoption throughout most of his writings of a staunchly pro-popular government stance? Does Machiavelli return to old figures of divine providence and monarchy at the very end of a book that called both of these in questions? Or is there another way of understanding the unexpected appearance of both God and monarch at the end of the prince? So let's begin by thinking about the way God favors some politics over others, or some cities over others, namely the question of particular divine providence or special providence. This is not a new question for Machiavelli, because in the Discourses on Livy, he pays a lot of attention to how the Romans thought that by engaging the wars successfully the way they did, they were meeting the favor of the gods. So here you have a very clear idea of particular providence. You conquer, I as God or gods will love you. This was the essence of Roman civil religion, essentially. But Savonarola's preaching had also brought to life for the Florentines another republic that received the favor of the true God, namely the Republic of the Hebrews. Here were two perfect case studies of God's active role in politics that Machiavelli could oppose to the way the Christian church conceived and taught for more than 1,000 years God's supposed disdain for imperialistic, aggressive politics. Can one then reconceive divine providence in such a way that it fits with how God, the function of God in the two most famous republics in the history of the West, the Roman and the Hebrew republics? Second question. Machiavelli's theory of chance in chapter 25 is completely naturalist, or proposes a kind of evolutionary perspective of human actions. Depending on the form of life, you will have success if they adapt with the circumstances. If they don't adapt to the circumstances, you will perish, and so on. You can work it out as a kind of proto-evolutionary idea. So now, no divine providence whatsoever. But in chapter 26, he stops talking about human history in a naturalistic way, and all of a sudden, he enters the theological register. Quote, here should be the PowerPoint. Beyond this, Machiavelli says, see here the extraordinary things without precedent conducted by God. The sea has opened, a cloud has shown you the way, the stone has poured forth water, here the manna has rained down, etc., etc. Is it possible to reconcile a staunchly naturalistic position with a doctrine of divine providence? How can we do it? Now, following Martelli here and others, of course, it's pretty evident. The one time that Machiavelli does talk about God before chapter 26 seriously is in chapter 6, when he proposes a very famous distinction between the armed prophet, Moses, and the unarmed prophet, Savonarola. Now, this distinction is clearly based on a distinction between a Jewish and a Christian conception of divine providence, which on many counts diverge completely from each other. If this is so, and this is what I propose, why not read Machiavelli's treatment of providence in chapter 26 as a consequence, as in light of, rather, a Jewish conception of providence rather than a Christian idea of providence? What difference does this make? And I will argue that it makes a whole difference. Medieval political thought, in fact, was not only a Christian affair. Outside of the Christian mainstream, sometimes against its current, medieval Arabic and Jewish thinkers asked the question of what kind of churchless republic, in quotation marks, God wished to establish through his prophets. Yes, obviously the Arab and Jewish political tradition, medieval tradition, does not believe that a structure like the church is the representative of God on earth. So there has to be another political organization that represents God on earth. So that's what makes it interestingly non-Christian. From Spain and Portugal through France and Germany, this political thought trickles down to Italian humanist culture by way of several possible conduits, some known and yet some to be completely discovered anew by future studies. This area is very poor in good scholarship. Certainly, the Latin Averism of Latini, maybe Dante, Marsilius of Padua, plays a significant role. So does the Hebraic Thomism of Ptolemy of Lucca or Savonarola, not to mention the strange Platonic theology and relation to Kabbalah that one finds in Pico, perhaps Ficino. And finally, there were many translations into Latin, or some translations in Latin, of Al-Farabi, Averroes, Maimonides. And closer still, in Machiavelli's Florence, two important Jewish political thinkers were also active, Johann Alemanno and Isaac Abravanel. Now, it is unclear, and I'm not suggesting, I don't know how many of these sources, by hearsay or whatever, Machiavelli could have absorbed. But I am pretty convinced that if he did hear of this or absorb this different way of understanding divine providence, he would have been an extremely interested and creative receiver of this idea. Now, why is that? Let's take the example of Moses Maimonides, the Guide of the Perplexed, and its reception in the Italian Renaissance, which is a huge theme of scholarship. But anyways, there was a reception of Maimonides in the Italian Renaissance, and it's very important, through Alemanno, Abravanel, and others. Now, in the Guide of the Perplexed, Maimonides puts forward an idea of divine nature. He says God has a double nature. His essence remains completely unknowable to human beings. So you can only approach it by what's called a negative theology. There's nothing that you can say. But God's existence, so to speak, on earth consists in 13 divine attributes of his glory. These attributes, according to Maimonides, are all political. So God only exists politically. That's the point. They therefore can be the object of human imitation, and they ground the possibility that the political action of human beings may fashion them into a likeness of God. In other words, if God's existence is entirely political, then by imitating these political actions, you can become like God politically, not by going to church and getting sacraments or acting in ways that we know the Christian teaching says. Maimonides also, interestingly enough, distinguishes between what he calls the pagan conception of religious laws, which he calls in Greek nomoi, and that's the equivalent of the Greek and Roman civil religion, and the Jewish Arabic conception of divinely revealed law, which he uses the term Sharia. So there is in Maimonides already a distinction that one thing is civil theology like the Romans and the Greeks had, and yet another thing is a different understanding of the role of God in politics that is figured in this philosophical idea of divine law. So seen from this perspective, Maimonides argues that in Moses' prophecy, God reveals himself as having divine attributes which are at the same time political attributes. This would mean, interpreted literally, that the only legitimate knowledge of God, the only legitimate theology, can only be a form of political science. That's the big idea of Maimonides. If God exists only politically, then theology must be political science. Yes? With Maimonides, then, we have an example of a political theology, which is not a civil religion, which does not set the authority of the priesthood or of a church above the authority of the people and their representatives, which is exactly what happens in the Christian Republic. On this reading, Maimonides makes it possible to unify politics and theology in a way that is entirely different from the unification proposed by Catholic theological and political thought since Augustine. And it has the added benefit that Maimonides avoids a rather crude understanding of religion, which became also popular in Latin Averroism. So I think that would be one example of an idea that Machiavelli could find very interesting of how to unite religion and politics. Now, the Jewish Arabic conception of divine providence differs completely from that of Christianity. As Giorgio Agamben has recently argued, the Christian conception of providence is characterized by its, what he calls, an economical logic, tied to the idea of divine dispensations or mysteries. In other words, very simply put, God does not save us all at one time. He sends dispensations. There's that kind of economy. He doesn't give you all the goodies immediately. So send Moses, then Jesus, then the Holy Spirit, and then we'll see, hopefully, at the end of the story, that we all come to a happy ending. So Christian providence depends on postulating a divine order in which history, human history, has a place that is neither the beginning nor the end of the divine calendar of human redemption. That is the Orthodox Christian idea, is that history plays an intermediate role, but is neither at the beginning nor at the end. Since God has, from all times, established the calendar of salvation at whose center stands the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, it follows that nothing can be done to accelerate the return of the Messiah. From an Orthodox Christian standpoint, the Messiah can never return in history, but only once history is finished, is at an end. This divine economy of salvation proclaims the Roman Catholic Church as the only legitimate representative of God on earth. So long as the Catholic Church still stands, the end of history has not yet been reached. A few centuries before Machiavelli, with a friar named Joachim Fiore, this dispensational conception of Christian providence begins a process of secularization, pointing to a divine order in history rather than a divine order of history. In other words, what Joachim Fiore says is that the Trinity, that is the dispensations of God, gets parsed in history. It's no longer at the end of history. So God, the idea returns that God realizes his plan in and through history, not only at the end of it or at the beginning. For early Christians, no historical event could reveal the mystery of God's economy of salvation. But after Joachim of Fiore's claim that history does reveal a divine plan after all, prophets can return to the realm of possibility. So after Joachim of Fiore, it becomes possible again to be a Christian prophet. But, and this is crucial, these new prophets must remain, in Machiavelli's words, unarmed. Why? Because, according to this idea of providence, it is history itself that will bring salvation to human beings behind the backs of political actors. And now this was, I think, the idea of providence that animated Savonarola. Thus, when Machiavelli calls Savonarola an unarmed prophet, what he means is that the prophet here is merely an interpreter of history, not a maker of history. The prophet cannot accelerate or cannot make so that the coming of the Messiah will be accelerated. Looking now at the alternative Jewish conception of divine providence, we see that God enters from the beginning human history as a military leader, Melech, of his chosen people, leading them in their campaigns to regain a promised land from other nations. God's people is organized from the beginning as an army whose leader, Moses, follows the commands of God. The figure, therefore, of the armed prophet, Moses, and the figure of the army commander of a free people are not different in early Jewish political theology. This is a particularly crucial point because it allows me to point out where I depart from Martelli's influential reading of chapter 26. He had argued that in the middle of chapter 26, Machiavelli stops talking about God and so on and goes on a long excursus about how the prince need to organize a popular militia that can fight the Spanish and the Swiss infantry. And he goes on and he all of a sudden starts talking Republican militia jargon. And Martelli says, well, the two things are incompatible. You cannot be talking about Republican militia and have this kind of messianic conception of politics. The only reason he says that is because he's thinking about a Christian idea of providence. If you switch the idea of providence to a Jewish model, the two things are completely compatible. Why is that? Well, because on a Catholic understanding of divine providence, the military order of the Catholic Church, Ecclesia Militans, composed of priests, believers, who love first God, and here comes the question of love. The Catholic Church is structured by you love first God and only secondly the world. It does organize the group of believers into a military formation, but one which preserves the mystery of the economy of divine providence. So in a way, it's organized so that God will not, as it were, militarily reappear in history. That's to be completely avoided. And anyone who tries to do that is immediately called, in this language, an antichrist, because they're anticipating the end of history. They're the fake Messiah. So the church does have a conception of God leading an army, but it is an entirely unearthly or counter-earthly or supernatural idea of a military organization of believers. This is not the case, as I've been trying to show, in the Jewish conception of providence. Here, the ordering of a popular army does not go against the logic of divine providence, because within Hebrew political theology, God's chosen commander of God's people, Moses and later Joshua, is not an absolute sovereign, an absolute king. Rather, the basic postulate of Hebrew political theology is that Moses is the antithesis of a sovereign king. The kingdom established through the covenant of God with his people belongs to God, not to Moses. Moses cannot be possibly a king. The armed prophet, therefore, is there to ensure that no king will rule God's people. And this is why it's compatible with fundamental republicanism. Republicanism is simply defined as a political form in which there is no king. One of the fundamental theses of the prince is that the people and nobles are always at war with each other. And a civil prince should always side with the people and proceed to form a popular militia or arm them, so as to not to rely on mercenary armies. Therefore, when Machiavelli speaks in Discourses on Livy 118, which is a famous passage that everybody refers to in the sense of this is where the Discourses point to the prince. So in the Discourses, a book about republicanism, Machiavelli all of a sudden starts to talk about the need for an absolute commander who has to behave, he says, in a manner quasi-regio, nearly regal. And this has puzzled people. Why is he talking about republicanism? All of a sudden in this chapter, he says there is a need for a nearly king-like commander of the army. Martelli thinks that this is, you see, Machiavelli is not really a republican. He wants a real form of monarchy. I don't think so. He does not mean thereby to establish that he wants to establish a kingdom and the abandonment of the civil principality. Rather, Machiavelli is referring himself to the nearly regal quality of Moses' theocratic regime, according to which Moses cannot become king because God is already in command of an armed people. And for the same reason, Moses cannot permit any monarch to have absolute power over his people. This conjunction of theocracy and popular government in the Hebrew Republic prior to the period of the kings, that is when the Jewish people decides to adopt kings for itself, was in a way already prefigured by Savonarola. This is from one of his preachings. Again, PowerPoint, sorry. Your regime, Florence, is similar to that of the judges of the Israelites. And I also want to say that this regime and government of the Hebrews, although it was democratic, populare, because the people held power and the judges did not command the people but merely counseled them, it could also be called a kingly government, governo regale, because it depended on the mouth of one, that is, of God, because God was he who ruled over them, because the mouth of the judge and of the prophet was counseled by God as to what they had to do. So this is very interesting. Already in Savonarola, when he analyzes the Hebrew Republic, it's radically democratic, I have to cut already, and at the same time has this kingly perspective. So basically the argument, what I'm saying is that when Machiavelli in chapter 26 begins to talk about a civil prince that need to ascend to a nearly regal position, he is referring to this context. All right, that's it. I have 5 minutes. Oh, I have to wind down. Okay, I'm one. But so far I've spoken about Machiavelli's Moses, but there is a problem, so to speak, that in Hebrew political theology, there are really two actors, so to speak, that have something significant to say about God's role in politics. One is, of course, Moses. He's at the beginning of the story. And the other is this figure, which is somewhat the anti-Moses, which is called the Messiah. Now, why is the Messiah necessary, so to speak? Well, the Messiah is necessary because actually the Hebrew people decided that Moses and his republic was not enough. And at a certain point, of course, they decide that they want to be like other nations and adopt a king. So they have this monarchic temptation, which they have to be purified from. And the whole doctrine of the Messiah is an internal critique, a way of purifying this monarchic temptation. Now, the same distinction between Moses and the Messiah is again found in the difference between chapter 6, which is about Moses, and chapter 26, which is really about a new prince, which has, as everybody has remarked, messianic connotations, not Mosaic connotations alone. So the tension between the Moses and the Messiah in Jewish political theology is also present in the Prince, chapter 26. Why is that fundamentally? Well, because prophets like Moses, as Machiavelli explains, need a people which is not really free, a people that has just come out of slavery, that doesn't know how to be free, and they need to be educated into freedom. But the Italian people, according to Machiavelli, is not such a people. They have had some education and freedom. Of course, the Christian church is always undermining this education. They need to be constantly re-educated in freedom, but it's there. That's the famous sentence in which he says, here in the people, not in the princes, there is great virtue in the limbs, in the body, not the head, provided she does not lack leaders. So what Machiavelli is trying to figure out is what will be this leader, this captain, of this potentially free people, educated in freedom. And what I want to argue, now I'm going to cut and not go into all the details, that this is why it would have to be a messianic leader. The point about a messianic leader is complicated. You have to lead the people as if you were their king, but what you're leading them is into doing away with all monarchic commands. So it's a complicated, you have to be regal in order to be non-regal. And I conclude now with the last point. There's one last feature of Jewish messianism that I think is important and that Machiavelli registers in chapter 26. Namely, the form of the chapter is an exhortation. This is the question which you find in Jewish political theology, whether human beings can do things that force or accelerate the arrival of the Messiah. Is there any way in which human beings, so to speak, can force God's hand and release the Messiah? The Christian idea of providence does not allow this. But for the Jewish concept of providence, at least according to certain traditions, it is possible to do that. One can pray in certain special times for the arrival of the Messiah now. Machiavelli's exhortation in chapter 26 seems to be just this kind of a prayer, which is said at the right time. Now, in one of his sermons, Savonarola refers to, in order to criticize it, Cosimo de' Medici's famous boutade, quote, "One does not govern a state by praying, nor by reciting, 'Our Father who art in heaven.'" Savonarola said that's terrible, yeah? Throughout The Prince, Machiavelli seems to agree with Cosimo. Of course, not by prayers can you lead a country. But now, at the end of the book, he addresses himself to a member or two of the Medici family in order to ironically subvert Cosimo's saying. Sometimes politics needs to be messianic. Sometimes politics needs to be based on prayer. But Machiavelli's messianism and his prayer is not Savonarola's, obviously. Machiavelli's prayer will be fulfilled only on condition that the time is right, and the criterion of rightness is whether the new prince has enough virtù to arm his or her own people. Not only is God unwilling to do everything, as Machiavelli says, and therefore awaits the right time to send the Messiah, Machiavelli is saying to the new Medici prince that only by becoming commander of an armed and free people will he have made himself into the image of God, who was a commander of his own people, and therefore be deserving of God's favor. Hence, Machiavelli ends his book by saying, unless the Medici are willing to purify themselves of their sins and repent of their previous associations with the nobility and the foreign kings of this world, and instead embrace the side of the people, then they will not live up to the image of God, and as a consequence, God will not grace them with the salvation of their state. Thank you very much.